You know, try one. Six. All right.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. We got a tremendous audience. I think we're already into the overflow auditorium. So you're going to have a tremendous crowd this evening. Anyway, I'm Gordon Jensen. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Research here at the Larner College of Medicine, and I'd like to welcome you to our 7th Annual Health Equity Lecture held as part of the UVM Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. I know that Dean Page would have loved to be here, but he's traveling out of state and I'm filling in his behalf. So across the UVM campus this week and into next, the life and work of Dr. King will be remembered for its accomplishments and enduring promise. And as we all know all too well, there's much work that still needs to be done to protect and strengthen his legacy and realize his vision. Here at the Larner College of Medicine, we take particular note of Dr. King's statement, and I quote, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane, and of course, all too common." So this series was established in order to explore matters of health equity within our system of healthcare. I look forward to hearing Professor Mercedes Carnethon this evening. She comes to us from the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago, so she's familiar with wind and snow, would fit right in here in Burlington. And she's done groundbreaking work in epidemiology with a focus on health disparities, including cardiovascular disease. I'd like to wrap up by thanking the Office of Diversity Inclusion for organizing this and other recent events, and in particular to thank Tiffany Delaney, Director of the Office, and Dr. Margaret Tando, our Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, for all their work. And I would now like to bring up Dr. Margaret Tando.
Good evening, everyone. It's really exciting to be here today. I'd really like to thank Dr. Carnethon for being here. This, as Gordon said, this is our 7th year now that we're putting on this lecture. I want to thank our community for actually showing up. It's been incredible that we've had an overflow room and we have people coming in at 4:30 because they want a seat. I mean, this is great. These are very important topics that we need to talk about and find solutions to problems that will make our world a better place. I too would really like to thank Tiffany Delaney for doing a lot of the work, and there's Alex Gagner, our office coordinator too. And I would really like, yes. And also Dean Page for his continued support has been invaluable. Now, though, I will turn it over to Dr. Russ Tracy. Dr. Russ Tracy is the University Distinguished Professor of Pathology and Lab Medicine. It's a lot here. Director.
Most of these guys know me. Don't worry about it.
So, I mean, Russ is like,
I've been around here a long time.
He's still Russ, though. He's still such a cool, awesome guy. So I'm going to have him introduce Dr. Carnethon.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a great personal and professional pleasure to introduce Mercedes Carnethon, or Mercy, to her friends. And we've met about 15 years ago at the sort of the beginnings of several of the epidemiology studies that we shared. And we've collaborated over the years a little bit. We have 3 papers together. Yeah, I just checked it out today. I had to do a PubMed search. Yeah. So a little bit more about Mercy. She got her bachelor's at Stanford in human biology, which I always thought of as a terrific thing to do you're beginning work in, MD, PhD, Master of Public Health and a PhD in epidemiology at an excellent training site, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They have this superb program in epidemiology there. And joined Northwestern as assistant professor in '02. Gordon mentioned a little bit about the research. One of the things to point out is that characterizing your work, it's focused a lot on subgroups of population. So many of us do large population research and cover all kinds of big numbers of people, but Mercy has really focused on subsets, socioeconomic status, gender and sexual orientation and gender identity subsets, racial subsets, really digging down into the, in particular, kinds of differences that those subsets have in their lives and how their lives go. So it's really, I think, a unique kind of epidemiology. Another feature you should know about her, she is a fabulous mentor. She has mentored many, many people at her home institution, but I know nationally in these multi-center epidemiology studies, many people on the national level as well, and have spoken about it at numerous venues, culminating in winning the Faculty Mentor of the Year award at the Feinberg School of Medicine in 2018, which is a really nice honor. Just a couple other things. She has obvious intellect, hard-won expertise in her field. Well, she packages that together with a very professional, in my opinion, professional, straight ahead, say it like it is approach. And that has made her extremely valuable. She is highly sought after both at Feinberg, 5 search committees in the last few years, including for the dean. It has 14 American Heart Association committee assignments in the last 10 years. For which she's gotten awards. Now editorial boards, associate editor of Circ, which is a lot of work and a very important position, the biggest cardiovascular journal we have, biggest and best one. And many review assignments, including chairing a major NIH study section for a number of years. So it's a very busy life and very productive life, one that's had enormous influence. So I would end by saying that she's a national thought leader in racial disparities surrounding obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. That's only not an exaggeration. It's actually not sufficient. She has served on almost a dozen consensus committees in the last few years that write the guidelines that doctors follow to deal with these very issues. So the impact really is national in scope and very, very productive and important. So it's great pleasure. I'm going to introduce to you Mercedes Carnethon, and she'll speak to us tonight on racial segregation and obesity and unhealthy connection.
Let me make sure this is working. Thank you so much, Russ. It's really such a pleasure to be here, and the kind words are always appreciated. People ask, do I feel nervous when I give talks? And I say, truly the most awkward part of it is the introduction of yourself, because you never know what people will say, and inevitably I'm left thinking, oh, but I could have done more. I should have done something differently. But it is really a great pleasure, and I really thank you all for welcoming me here and spending time. So I'm very pleased today to talk about an area of research that actually I came to through one of my mentees. And this is actually in part why I really love mentoring, because it exposes me to research areas that may not have been at the top of my mind, but that provide so many more insights into health that we face. I have a couple degrees, but this one? Should I put it at this? Got it. Okay. I'm gonna. So, trying a new style, more of a narrative and artistic style, which is to say, what does segregation look like? This is a photograph from 43rd and South Cottage Grove in Chicago. What it looks like here is boarded up doors. What does segregation feel like? And I chose this particular visual for it because I was really struck by the phrase beauty, Black beauty. And there's nothing about this that looks beautiful to me. How does segregation make people feel? And the headline on this Chicago Tribune article says, Chicago Park District failing Black and brown neighborhoods. And what is the health impact of segregation, which is what I'm going to talk about here. And what this figure shows, and I will show it to you in greater detail later, is that the darker spaces are where life expectancy is shorter. And you see clusters of the 60 to 64 years for life expectancy in Chicago. And so I put this cover up here, The Art of JAMA, to tell a story that 2 weeks ago, one of my good friends who's an artist sent me an advertisement for a talk that she was going to be doing at the School of Social Services Administration at the University of Chicago. She's a visual artist, and she is an artist and architect who looks at how places convey value, how architecture makes people feel, and how that imparts value in the Chicago community and around the world. And I said, well, when is your talk? And she said, well, it's on the 21st. And I said, oh, you know what? I'm actually going to be talking about residential segregation and obesity. And she said, we should do something together sometime. She said, I'll send you some slides and I'll tell you about some great artwork that's going on. And I thought this was great because art matters. And, you know, throughout my training, I've been so focused on learning my disease area that I feel like I've missed much of the world that's going on. But I noticed that these things are critically important. You know, one of our leading medical journals has an entire series called The Art of JAMA, where they feature artwork from physicians or depictions of various medical things. So I want to try to integrate this with some art and photography. Let me do it over here. So my friend is Amanda Williams. She's an artist and architect, and she uses color as a lens to highlight the complexities of politics, race, and value. And she has a famous series that I'll tell you a little bit more about that painted the exterior of homes that were about to be demolished in the Chicago areas, and then photographed them. She's gotten international renown for her work. She's a US Artist Fellow and is a member of the design team for the Obama Presidential Library. And so she uses a palette of inspiration for colored theory. And some of you may or may not know some of these products. Ultra Sheen, which is a hair product that's a bright blue, pink oil moisturizer, these safe passage signs, Flamin' Hot Cheetos, which, so I'm from Seattle. I'd not seen these. I don't know if they're a Chicago thing, but they're these neon, oh, they're here? They're these like bright reddish orange Cheetos. They stain people's fingers and they're very popular, particularly in the Black community. And then Newports. And so she went out, painted these houses, colors, the safe passage currency exchange, loose squares, Newports, Ultra Sheen, Flamin' Red Hots, Crown Royal bag, and pink oil moisturizer, and she photographs these. And these are all over, and you know, she's gotten a lot of acclaim for this colored series theory. And you know, she and I have these interesting talks about, you know, what does this mean for value? And we had an interesting discussion the other night about health and wealth. And so the outline of my talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about the past, what got us here, policies, built environment, and the social environment, how that has contributed to segregation, what that has led to in our present regarding disparities, and then a term that a colleague coined for me, which is what would the future perfect look like? Not just the future, which would just be where we're headed, but what would the perfect future look like? And so this is a figure showing racial and ethnic diversity by state. The most diversified states are in blue, the least diversified in orange. We can see sort of where we both collectively stand. Maine, a little closer to the least diversified. Chicago, a little more on the end of the most diversified. And I'm from Seattle, Washington, which is somewhere in the middle there. I pulled up some information about Vermont because I was very curious. And you know, Burlington is relatively diverse. I mean, when we look at the full state of Vermont, it is 93% white, small percentage Asian and Hispanic, relatively small proportion of Blacks. By comparison, Burlington, 85%, with 6% Asian, non-Hispanic, Black, and Hispanic. And so, you know, the diversity in this particular town certainly is more diverse than the rest of the state. So by contrast, and the reason that I'm going to use Chicago really is a model for the talk that I'm going to do is when we talk about the most segregated cities in America, Detroit, Chicago, and Memphis. Chicago routinely lands near the top of the most segregated cities. And part of that has to do with the history of the migration, the Great Migration, the first and second waves, where Blacks left the South and came to Chicago. We are also a major hub for Hispanics and Latinos. And I believe one of the fastest growing race groups in Chicago is actually Asians. So we have a very diverse city. The city was designed to be segregated. You can't read all of the labels on here, but this was a map in 1950 explaining where the different ethnic groups lived. And they were very ethnically concentrated in certain areas. And this was all by design. You could match this up by educational level, by resources, and people stayed with their own communities. And this was really, it was a big change when I moved from the West Coast, having primarily grown up on the West Coast. I certainly spent time in North Carolina, but to come to an area where they say, well, no, the Irish are there, or this is Ukrainian village is here, and the Blacks live on the South side and the West side, and these are the more diverse communities. So Chicago has a long history of this, and by design. So as of the 2010 census, the distribution of race and ethnicity in Chicago, 45% white, 32% Black, 5% Asian, 28% Hispanic, and 3% 2 or more. A full, 1 in 5 of our population is foreign born, the majority from Latin America, although a large proportion from Europe and Asia. And this figure shows the concentration of African Americans in the city on both our south and west sides. So there's a project by an artist, and we'll return back to thinking about the map. So Chicago is set up on a grid system where there's a north-south and an east-west. And it's actually fairly easy to learn how to get around Chicago because everything's on this very even grid, but you have the same address on the north side of the city as you have on the south side of the city, and very different values of the homes, very different demographics of who lives in these places. So this artist, Tonica Johnson, brought together people who were map twins who lived at the same address but on different sides. So these are 2 map twins, and the project was meant to invite dialogue about the systemic and political issues that segregate the city and affect health and wealth. So this is 6800 North Hermitage Avenue, which is actually in one of our more diverse communities, Rogers Park. It is one of the northernmost areas in the city of Chicago before you enter Evanston. 42% white, 1/4 Black, 1/4 Hispanic, 6% Asian. Very diverse area of the city. The home values, the median household income here is relatively low for the city. A 5-bedroom home, though, goes for $760,000. So the map twin at 6800 South Hermitage Avenue, this is West Englewood. I don't know if anybody's heard of Englewood. Sometimes it ends up on the news for various reasons. I can't think of the most recent reason, but it probably wasn't that positive of a reason you heard about it. It is a community that is 91% Black, 6% Hispanic, and 1% white. The median household income is $27,000, and a 5-bedroom home is $212,000, which is actually pretty high because I suspect, well, there just probably aren't that many 5-bedroom homes, because I suspect a house could be had in the West Englewood area for $60,000 would be probably more like the going rate for a 3-bedroom home. So you think about what this means for the individuals who live there and how their housing translates to their wealth. And so again, this is the same slide I was showing about estimated life expectancy, with the darker squares reflecting 60 to 68 years of life. And you can see that the darker squares, where we have the shorter life expectancy, are in those areas that are predominantly African American. If I pulled up the slide showing where Hispanics and Latinos are, they are also on the southwest side of the city. So probably is, yeah. So Hispanics are largely in this area of the city. There are a few up here in the west side, the Humboldt Park area. But again, we see these patterns of life expectancy that are patterned by the people who live there. And this slide, this project by the Virginia Commonwealth University, really put into mind what we see for these disparities in life expectancy. So Northwestern University, where I work, is in the Streeterville area of downtown, also called the Gold Coast. If you go 7 stops away out west, you have a life expectancy of 72 years in the Austin community. If you go about 7 or 8 miles south in the, let me see what, Washington Park neighborhood, which is about 2 blocks from my house, we have an average life expectancy of 69 years. So within one city, you see a wide range of life expectancy depending on which neighborhood people live in. And Chicago is not the only place with place-based disparities. I suspect I could find them here as well. I saw a very interesting poster by a student I believe you worked with about obesity across counties in Vermont. And this Virginia Commonwealth program described these place-based disparities in multiple cities across the country. They've done this in multiple places, and depending on where I go hear a talk, I will see people present information from each of these cities. And these arise from multiple factors, none of which would surprise you: education and income, unsafe and unhealthy housing, limited opportunity for physical activity, disproportionate exposure to air pollution from roadways and industries, limited access to healthcare providers, unreliable and expensive public transit, which would provide an escape for people to go get the resources that they need, but when you can't get out of these communities, that's very hard. Particularly when the urban design is set up by setting roadways to keep populations away from one another and cut off access to resources. A stark example of this is my uncle moved to Chicago as part of the Great Migration in the 50s out of Alabama. And he moved to the south side of Chicago, where he had moved around various places. And when I moved to Chicago in 2002, I said, okay, great, I'm working for Northwestern University in Evanston. I said, what's Evanston like? And he said, you know, I've never been to Evanston. And I thought, you've lived in this city for 50 years and you never left the northern border of the city of Chicago. And he said, well, you know, there was no reason for us to ever go up to Evanston. So, you know, I piled him in my car to take him to the first suburb north. But people generally stay in their areas. My husband works at a high school on the south side of the city, and they took the kids downtown to a restaurant. And there's no reason they would ever have left their communities to even go downtown to have a meal in a nice neighborhood. So poverty and race in the United States really overlap. So, you know, I'll talk a lot about racial residential segregation, but a lot of what we're talking about are poor communities. Poverty in the United States, those states that are in the darkest purple are those states with the highest rates of poverty. Not unexpectedly, those are clustered. We see a lot in the southeastern belt of the United States. On the right side is race ethnicity in the United States. And these are counties where minorities are overrepresented. And again, we see many of these same counties in the southeastern belt of the United States where we also see high rates of poverty. So I wanted to actually describe a little bit locally, because I can keep talking about Chicago and nationwide, and I assume you know much about your own city. But it was, you know, fairly easy to find in the American Community Survey, and I actually had looked this up for a project that I'm doing in collaboration with a group in pulmonology here at University of Vermont. But 24% of adults in the Burlington area are living in poverty. The highest proportion of race groups living in poverty are Blacks at 31%, and the lowest are Asians at 16%. Contrast this with Chicago, which really doesn't look that different. So 20% overall poverty, again, and strangely the exact same proportion. The vast majority living in poverty are Blacks. In Chicago, the lowest proportion living in poverty are whites. And so we have two very different cities with different racial compositions, but we see many of the same challenges that you would see here. So patterns of obesity, which are what I'm here to talk about, again, is the graph showing poverty in the United States. And not surprisingly, we see similar patterns again with the darker colors representing higher rates of self-reported obesity, which one can always assume that self-reported obesity is an underreporting. But even with that underreporting, we see higher rates of obesity in those states that are the most impoverished. And I'm sure we all have hypotheses about that, and I will discuss some of why that is. And so when we think about our past and present, you know, there are some very interesting books about racial residential segregation being a very deliberate action of policies and of politics that even though there are laws in place to prevent racial residential segregation, it persists and the systemic issues remain, because it's very difficult to say we're going to take a law off the book and immediately we're all going to be integrated. That's not what happens. And what we have found is a persistent legacy of the highest rates of segregation in the Northeast and in the Midwestern cities around the Great Lakes. And what we find and what relates to health in this context is the unequal distribution of resources and opportunities in these racially segregated communities. So that brings us to where we are, and I'm an epidemiologist. I count people and I count things. And what role does racial segregation play in obesity? So many of you know a lot about obesity. Obesity has risen faster than any chronic disease in the past 4 decades. And after a great discussion with Russ yesterday about how I spin what my research is, I say, well, you know, I study obesity because it is related to every major disease out there. Chronic diseases, worsening outcomes from accidents and injuries. It's associated with inverse socioeconomic drift. Obese individuals are likely to be paid less, discriminated against. An important point too is obesity rates over time have gone up across the life course, from toddlers to older adults. The highest burden is in non-white minorities and in lower socioeconomic groups, but no population subgroup is immune from rising rates of obesity. And again, associated with a wide range of health outcomes. So these two figures really depict the trends that we see in obesity. This is starting in 1960 to 62, going all the way up to 2013, 2014. We see around the 80s, rapid increases in obesity in men and women, increases in extreme obesity. And these are adults ages 20 to 64, which have brought us to where we are now, where 3/4 of adults are overweight or obese. Obesity and extreme obesity, nearly 40%. Overweight, 1 in 3 adults. Many hypotheses about what changed. Some of those are just changing social norms. One of the hypotheses is related to work outside the home. The use of packaged foods, convenience foods. Our lifestyles have changed. We've taken activity and movement out of our daily work. So more sedentary activities, more screen time, more fast and processed foods. This figure from the National Center for Health Statistics describes the prevalence of obesity by race and ethnicity. And the dark blue are non-Hispanic whites, and this is total. This lighter blue are non-Hispanic blacks. We see Asians around 13%, and then Hispanics at 47%. So you can see across the entire population and in men and in women, we see the highest rates of obesity in Black and Hispanic groups, particularly notable among women, and then lower rates among Asians. And I'll point out, and I wish I'd had time to actually pull this information, that while we see lower rates of obesity among Asians, we're really obscuring some of the differences that we see when we don't consider country of origin. A very important paper came out right around Christmas about rates of diabetes in Asians, where they disaggregated, and we see much higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and other metabolic disorders in South Asians, in Filipinos, and lower rates in some of the East Asian populations. And so part of what we're doing with collecting national data is going to be very important to really disaggregate, because there's a great deal of heterogeneity within groups. And these are adults ages 20 plus. But it's not likely, so if I were to just talk about the future, it's not looking good. These are youth ages 2 to 19 years old, and we see the same patterns. This blue are African American, Hispanic again are the light green. You can see for both boys and girls, markedly high rates of obesity in youth ages 2 to 19 years old. And one thing we know from our epidemiologic studies is that overweight and obesity track over time. One of my areas of research has been on unique obesity phenotypes. And people say, but what about obese people who don't develop risk factors? Over time, we find in our longitudinal studies, risk factors develop. And so many of the risk factors for obesity as well as diabetes have been described. And I can put them roughly into, say, 3 categories. We often think about the individual risk factors: excess energy intake, calorically dense foods, physical inactivity, insufficient sleep, which people don't often think about, but is very important, genetics, even programming through birth, prenatal period. And then the environmental factors, which is where we start talking about what's in our communities that's really promoting obesity, and the socioeconomic factors that drive one to be in one community versus another. The environmental factors: lack of access to safe spaces for activity, food deserts, social communities and friendships. You know, are you friendly with your neighbors? Are you afraid of your neighbors? Certain microbiota, endocrine disrupting chemicals coming from the air, coming from water. There are a number of hypotheses about how the environment is also influencing obesity. And this is work done by a review by Frank Hu, the chair of nutrition at Harvard. He's done a lot of work in this space. So what about one's environment influences their obesity? Could it be these corner stores? And this is the picture from Chicago that Amanda took. This is about what's in the corner store. I will say I've been in some of them. This is a picture from Philadelphia. How many of you would like to go take a walk down this street? This is Baltimore. I had the opportunity, one of my friends works at Johns Hopkins, and we were walking around the neighborhood, and she was showing me homes that look like this and some of the homes that they're putting in their place. Again, not very aesthetically pleasing, certainly not very calming. And this is Los Angeles. And what's hard to see here are the tents where people live. So we have large homeless populations. So one thing that is somewhat different whenever I go back to Seattle, there are entire tent cities. You know, one thing that's interesting about Seattle is that with the tech influence, the cost of living and the median home prices are so high that working adults can't afford homes, and people who are struggling can't afford homes. And Los Angeles is somewhat similar. And so you've got people living in tents on the streets. Again, how safe do you feel going out for a run or for a walk in the morning? There's an artist on the South Side, Edra Soto, and what she's on the west side of Chicago. She collects discarded bottles that people have thrown around. So people just throw trash on the streets where she lives. She collects them, she shines them up, and she puts them on display and turns them into art. And the reason she says she does this is for her own mental wellness, because when she goes out to walk her dog, she feels disappointed, she feels angry that the people who live in the community along with her don't care about the community. And so she has found a way to turn it into a moment of beauty. And so her artwork is featured very prominently, and she is another person in the Chicago area who speaks a lot about how our environment and our community affect our mental wellness. So residential segregation in health has gotten increasing attention. And the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, I think, has been behind a lot of important work in this area. They acknowledge the contribution on physical and mental health. And what racial residential segregation is described as the systematic sorting of racial and ethnic minorities into poor quality neighborhoods characterized by high crime rates and limited access to healthy foods, safe spaces for physical activity, and limited high-paying entry-level jobs. There is a disparate influence of segregation on health between non-whites and whites, whereas residential segregation for whites is generally associated with better health outcomes. However, there are some ethnic enclaves where we see surprisingly better health outcomes, and I'll talk about some of those somewhat unexpected findings as we think about the future perfect. So I was actually exposed to this area of research by my colleague, Dr. Tre Kershaw, who trained as a social epidemiologist from the University of Michigan. She worked with Ana Diaz-Rue's group, for those of you who know her work on neighborhoods and health. She came to work with me as a postdoc and then, stayed on as a faculty member, and I serve as one of her mentors. And her area of focus has always been on residential segregation, using different measures, the racial isolation index, and then also some relative measures of segregation. Right now, she's working on how factors that drive food choices in lower income Black and Hispanic women, and that's the topic of her K Award. And so she has measured racial residential segregation in multiple cohort studies, public use databases, and even used our electronic health record to try to get at these answers within our healthcare system. And I've been participating with her on a series of papers highlighting these adverse influences. And so one of the first ones that we did when she was a postdoc was using the NHANES study, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And so we say, what is it about neighborhoods? Is it just that the neighborhoods are poor neighborhoods? And so we said, well, rather than describing just the association of the neighborhood residential segregation, we would explore whether neighborhood poverty mediated these associations in both Black and Hispanic women, because less has been done with Hispanic isolation, and I've seen even less on Asian enclaves and isolation. And so the methods that she used were to generate a Black and Hispanic isolation index, which was defined as the average percentage of the population that is Black or Hispanic in the neighborhood in which they live in a given city. And so I'll walk you through some of these findings. I know these are a little dense. So on the left panel is the Black Isolation Index, high meaning high levels of Black isolation, so more segregated communities. And this is the odds of being obese. So this is a cross-sectional study. Obviously, we don't know which came first. Cross-sectional study in NHANES. But what we found is that following adjustment for foreign-born status, education level, income, neighborhood poverty, and neighborhood income incongruity, that Blacks were 30%, Blacks living in high Black isolation index, so highly segregated communities, were 30% more likely to be obese than those living in low segregated communities. Same with medium. And these are women, so these are the findings for women. What was very interesting, and probably the more innovative piece of the paper, was that we found an inverse association for Hispanic women. That Hispanic women living in segregated communities actually had a lower odds of obesity. We have a number of hypotheses about this that we have subsequently explored in work that I've done in the Hispanic Community Health Study, describing things such as resilience, collective efficacy, what it means to be part of a community. And also, within work that we've done further in the Hispanic Community Health Study, the extent to which acculturating to the US is harmful for health versus maintaining traditional foods, traditional beliefs, and behaviors. And as my colleague said, she said the challenge there is that in her research and in her work with predominantly immigrant communities, that people are very proud to be able to offer their children McDonald's. And the young children are very excited to be just as American as their peers. And so there's a lot of what she described, and this is actually an Asian colleague described this as well, a lot of overfeeding of US-based foods. But so we explored this a little further. One thing we found that will come up in a few more studies that I'll describe is no association in men. So Chiari later went on to get funding to generate a new statistic called the G statistic, Gerd and, oh, there it is, Geddes and Ord. And this returns a Z-score for each neighborhood census tract, indicating the extent to which the racial composition in the tract and the neighboring tracts deviates from the mean racial composition of the surrounding larger unit. This is the formula. Please don't ask me to walk you through it. But for those of you who love math, and since I'm in a somewhat mathematical field, I felt obligated to offer it and pretend that I was going to walk through it. But it's essentially a relative measure of segregation. Because you can say, for example, would I say, what would Burlington look like? If I just returned a strict proportion, we'd say, oh, well, it must be very, not segregated, but relative to neighboring areas, it is a little more diverse. And so this particular index takes into account the surrounding counties and areas. And let me tell you a little bit about how it works. So this is a paper, this is findings from a paper in Circulation that was drawing the association of neighborhood racial residential segregation with the incidence of CHD. Because we have individual measures in the MESA study, the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, she was able to describe what does income look like in segregated communities. So the highly segregated communities are in green and the low segregated communities are in purple. So this is the proportion of, these are adults, this is the proportion of adults reporting income of less than $25,000. And so consistent with our hypothesis, those Black and Hispanic adults living in highly segregated communities were more likely to report low income, so less than $25,000 per year, whereas among whites, they were less likely to report low income. And this was consistent for other measures of socioeconomic status, education, as well as neighborhood socioeconomic indicators. And I shared this particular finding to show that these measures are reflecting what we expect them to reflect, which is individual poverty measures as well as neighborhood poverty measures. But then I'm going to skip to a longitudinal study where we use the same statistic in the coronary artery risk development in young adult studies. And one of the limitations of prior work on neighborhood racial residential segregation is that much of it is cross-sectional. And as I mentioned, there is this socioeconomic drift that happens, that obese individuals are likely to be discriminated in employment and in pay, and so can make less money. And so the goal of this particular study, led by a postdoctoral fellow, Lindsay, who was supported by an HA Disparities Fellowship we had, was to determine how changes in racial residential segregation over time are associated with obesity incidence. And in the Cardia study, which I'll describe, so we used the G statistic and we categorized segregation into high, medium, and low, just as was done in the MESA study. So Cardia is unique because these were adults who were 18 to 30 years old, initially measured in 1985 and 86. And whereas they were recruited from 4 places, Birmingham, Alabama, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Oakland, over the course of 30 years, and we're starting our 35-year follow-up in June, they have moved to every state in the country, and they've moved multiple times. They've been followed over time, and we have 71% retention, which is pretty good for a study of this length. And so these are the percentage of Black men and women by neighborhood racial residential segregation by year of exam. And over time, what this is showing is that both men and women over time move to less segregated communities. So as they age, they were able to move to less segregated communities. So we had a lot of movement. And then we have the challenge of thinking about ways to measure this movement over time in relation to incidence. So this was a very interesting experience with this particular journal, Epidemiology, that's required a lot of different analyses. I've highlighted 2. It's technically complex. One was discrete time hazard, which I won't go into too much, but it's your traditional time to event model. But the critical thing here is we used 2 measures of segregation to measure over time. There was baseline segregation, which we found not to be associated with the incidence of obesity, time varying segregation, where we were able to update their community over time and study that in relation to the incidence of obesity. And what we found using different type of model that accounted for correlations among variables, marginal structural models, is that those adults who were moving to more segregated areas had a 30% higher likelihood of developing obesity. Again, these are women, no associations among men. When we looked at cumulative segregation over time, how long did they spend in segregated communities? Again, women who spent more time in highly segregated communities were more likely to become obese. And again, no associations among men. we thought a lot about, what were some of the explanations here. Obviously, the key things: fewer resources, access to grocery stores, density of parks and other public recreation spaces, the stress of living in segregated areas. And one of the benefits of the longitudinal study in Cardia, the range of factors that we measured. So our models were, we made an attempt to account for many of these things: depressive symptoms over time, reports of stress, access. We have other geocoded measures to measure supermarket density, park density, neighborhood walkability. And then a third factor that was brought up were differing social perceptions of obesity. There's been research to show that a larger body weight is more socially acceptable in Black communities as compared with other communities. And so, that could be another reason why. However, none of these explanations account for differences by sex. And that is something that remains something of a mystery. We have some hypotheses, and I'll be interested in generating a little discussion about that. But some of what we've talked about are that men may be more likely to leave the community for work or for other things, and possibly the social relationships within the community may not be as closely tied for men versus women. We truly don't know. And it's a very, interesting consideration. So subsequent work that Chiari led with some of our postdoctoral fellows used data from a study that she formed for her K Award. And this was a study of neighborhood disorder and obesity-related outcomes in women in Chicago, using 3 objective measures of neighborhood physical and social disorder, a cross-sectional study of 228 women. The innovation here were the 3 methodologies. One was Google Street View to create a physical disorder scale using previously validated measures. And to tell you a little bit about that, so I don't know if you ever use Google Maps to find somewhere, you'll notice that there are pictures in there that will show you a snapshot of where you're going, which I always find very helpful when I'm going to a building I may or may not know. I say, okay, which building do I need to look for? Which side of the street? There's a way to, when you enter these street segments, you can actually look to see what do you see in the background. These raters go out and take these pictures at various times, and they capture things in the background. They capture trash, they capture disorder. And actually, I'll show you the list of things. But the second and third were police reported crimes and rates of 311 calls for physical disorder related complaints. But so in the space of characterizing neighborhoods, there's a couple ways to go about it. Many of you hear about us using census-derived measures and matching it up with public use data. But a lot of times it's really important to go out and do the ground truthing, which is to go out, you send raters into the field who use a scale to say, okay, how many pieces of equipment in this park are broken? How much trash do I see? Is this high? Is this moderate? Is this low? This is expensive and time consuming because you need more than one rater to do it at that exact time of day, and then you've got to come up with agreement. And so using Google Street View was a way to pack a number of students in a room who needed various projects, take pictures of the areas where these women lived because we have their addresses, and match it up that way and use these rating scales. So trash and garbage, abandoned vehicles, graffiti scrubbed or painted over, which means someone at least tried. Other defaced property, bars on windows and doors, abandoned and boarded up buildings. What is the condition of the building? Is it deteriorating, well-kept, moderate? And then vacant lots. What else do you see? And so you can't have just one person do this. You've got to actually see what the agreement is. And so she did this with a team of students. They trained them. They used validated questionnaires that one would typically use for on-the-ground ground truthing. And they used Google Street View. And what they found, so there were in some no associations with BMI, continuously measured physical activity, sugar sweetened beverage consumption, fast food consumption, or weekly snack consumption. But what the models are and what they show are associations in cross-section categorically with obesity. A physical disorder score from Google Street View was associated in the second model that adjusted as well for neighborhood poverty with a 40% higher likelihood of obesity among the women who lived in these communities with more physical disorder. We didn't see anything similar for police recorded crime rate or the rate of 311 calls. And an interesting thing about the crime rate, when we talk about social disorder, is it's very hard to use measures of crime because when you watch the news, you don't necessarily know if the crime happened in that neighborhood. And when you hear reports of crime over and over again, it becomes in some ways less shocking to people, you know, unless they're shooting outside your window nightly. You do tend to, so we don't see very strong effects in general for reporting of crime or even actual gunshots in relation to psychological distress. So what we know are that we see very adverse associations of neighborhood racial residential segregation with obesity in Blacks through multiple pathways, resources, psychosocial stress, community norms and values that could enhance risk. We see inverse associations among Hispanics, and we consistently are seeing these findings only among women. What we don't know is how ethnic enclaves can protect health and promote resilience, how residential segregation influences the health in Asians, how to promote the positives of segregation to enhance health, and why segregation may not pose the same health effects among men. So I think there's still a great deal of work to be done there. However, as we continue documenting those, I'd really like to move us toward the future perfect. So what would healthy communities for all look like? America is increasingly becoming more diverse. So this line right here, I guess we're at 2020. Oh, how dated that it was projected. We are here, time to move the line. So we're obviously here. We have a 60% white population right now. You know, within the next 40 years, 43%, we will be in a majority minority America. And so we do need to care about the health of all. And, you know, a recent, I was questioned about something. We say, well, why should we care about disparities? And I say, you know, disparities are an important issue, not just for disparities populations, but because they affect the health of everybody. Resources are going to treating and managing health conditions that are overrepresented in disparities populations. Those resources are taking away from prevention. They're taking away from innovation in identifying and treating diseases for everybody, which is why I think promoting health equity in a country that's increasingly diverse needs to be a high priority for all. So one option, which is interesting. So when Chiari is interviewed on this and when I'm interviewed on this, well, what should we do? Should we move people out of segregated communities? Has anybody heard of the Moving to Opportunity program? Very interesting program. So it was a randomized social experiment for fair housing. It was a 10-year research demonstration project that combined rental assistance with housing counseling to help very low-income families move from poverty-stricken urban areas to low-poverty neighborhoods. So the social experiment was sponsored by the Department of Housing and Urban Development for families with children ages less than 18 years old, and it was conducted in Chicago, Baltimore, Boston, LA, and New York. And approximately 4,500 participants completed a baseline survey and had their height and weight measured and hemoglobin A1C. And I just really applaud the people who added these health measures. I wish they could have done more, but it's just fantastic that they did at least this. Because what they did was they randomized these families to either receive a low poverty voucher, which meant that they got a housing voucher and counseling, and they were required to use their voucher to move to a low poverty area, versus the others who just got a voucher and said, you may move wherever you would like, and they could use it anywhere. So on the left side here are the low poverty voucher, and these are the traditional poverty voucher. So this is body mass index, and this is the prevalence of body mass index, greater than 30, class 1 obesity, class 2, and higher. So BMI 35 or higher, and this is a hemoglobin A1C of greater than 6.5%, corresponds with diabetes. And what they found in the low poverty, those individuals given the low poverty voucher were less likely, this is a negative coefficient, less likely to have a BMI of greater than 35 over time. They were less likely to have a BMI of greater than 40, and they were less likely to have elevated hemoglobin A1C. whereas there were no effects among those who received the traditional voucher. So moving people to lower poverty areas was associated with improvements in BMI and risk for diabetes. So, you know, we see this in our field. I'm like, this is great. What do we do? You know, let's move people. But, you know, how do people feel who have to move? And this is the story of the Cabrini Green housing project, which was built in 1942. And when it was built, it was really highlighted as a beacon. This was for working class. It was predominantly for working class whites. It was on the north side of the city. You had to meet certain qualifications to live in Cabrini Green. I think you had to be married, you had to be employed, but these were people who were stockyard workers and lower income workers in the city who had families. It was a great place, lots of resources. They even went so far, there were schools on the ground of Cabrini Green. So fast forward over time to the changing demographics of Chicago, this became a 100% Black area with high rates of crime, the schools, windows shot out. I first heard about Cabrini Green in undergraduate in a sociology class that described what not to do when you talk about supporting the lives of people, and what you don't do is create these segregated towers of people. And these were multiple towers that spread out over a large area. And you know, you don't even, the kids don't even leave Cabrini Green. They don't see that people have jobs every day. They don't see that adults go to work, because all they see is Cabrini Green. Their schools are on site, and you know, so in the mid 2000s, they said, we're going to take them down and we're going to build mixed income housing. This is a very progressive idea. We're going to knock down these towers. And I said, well, you know, that seems like a smart idea. But one thing I hadn't considered is how people feel who have to move. So so the Alumni Association for my school had a showing of this movie called 70 Acres in Chicago, which is approximately the amount of space that Cabrini Green took up. And it was a film that this woman had made where she interviewed residents and described the history of Cabrini Green and what it meant for people to move. So I go there. My husband grew up in Chicago. He moved there from Liberia when he was 8, so longtime Chicagoan. And you know, he knew all about Cabrini Green. And we must have gone with different mindset, because I was like, people are gonna be so grateful that, you know, we took down Cabrini Green, we knocked this down, we got rid of the crime, we got rid of everything. So this was shot over 20 years. And it documents the upheaval from the raising of the first buildings in 1995 to the problems of the mixed income communities that they created and the impact on the people. So it was a viewing of the movie, and then it was a discussion. So even after viewing the movie and seeing the tears and seeing how people felt, my thought still was, but the health is now going to be so much better because we spread people around the city. And that wasn't it at all. And you know, some of the quotes from the people, it's hard watching your home being destroyed. I hope they replace it with something better for the people here. Because what they did was they took it down, but you had to apply to live in the mixed income housing there, and you had to meet certain qualifications. Nobody in your family could have been in prison or was currently in prison. If anybody over age 18 was living there, they had to be employed a certain number of times per week. So they were very restrictive on who could move back in, and people were spread throughout the city. This boy, he said, hey, it's my playground because I play in it. I stay in it and I live in it. It's home to me. I love Cabrini Green. He had a dog walking business. He was devastated. And then Deidre Brewster said, we're still standing, but a lot of people fell through the cracks. And this is when we talk about violence in Chicago right now, what a lot of people cite is the destabilization of the gangs that came from raising these large public housing projects where the violence was once contained to these areas, in spreading it out throughout the city and destabilizing the neighborhoods. That's what a lot of people are claiming has led to the rise in violence across the city of Chicago. And so, you know, coming from a health perspective, I hadn't considered the psychological benefits that people felt from being part of a community, being part of Cabrini Green. And my thought just was, well, gosh, now you've got parks and restaurants and different places. And people said, but it doesn't feel like home and there's nobody looking out for me. And so I think the second option, change the communities where people live. Behavior change often comes down to individual behavior changes, but we need environments that support those behavior changes, the physical environment, the community design, transportation, noise levels, the social environments. What do we have available for education, health services, the economic environment? Are there jobs and opportunities in communities? And then is there access? Is there access to healthy foods, physical activity and safe spaces? Are we monitoring drug use? Are we monitoring these things? And so really changing the communities is the better option. I do a lot of work. I'm on the board for the American Heart Association in Chicago, and they have formed this social impact fund based on a donation from a donor that said, you know, where you live shouldn't determine how well or how long you live. And so they're giving these organizations $1 million to bring forth an idea. Because when we think about who can actually typically successfully compete for most traditional grants, it's people in highly competitive institutions who have examples of what grants look like. And so they took a chance. And, you know, two of these are one that I'll show you, 40 Acres Fresh Market. It's a social enterprise focused on food access and food insecurity. So bringing foods to people. And then Sweet Potato Patch uses smart technology and GPS tracking systems to deliver healthy food options to people living in urban food deserts. So these are individuals who had a vision of making, say, for example, 40 Acres, affordable foods, accessible, fresh, and local. And this is based on the west side of Chicago, which is an urban food desert. So, you know, I see as we turn the lens towards caring about how we can make these changes, a lot of innovative solutions to improve the communities so that we can retain the positive benefits of the collective efficacy of living in a given community. So I do think that a future perfect could exist. I think it requires agreement on the changes to be made, resources in place to make those changes, and policies to support those changes. And then the people who are willing to invest in sustaining those changes. And the key to getting people willing to invest in sustaining those changes are using community engaged approaches. So getting the people for whom the modifications apply to contribute to telling you what do they want to see. A sense of collective efficacy and ownership over the changes that are made, and as well as social and functional support to implement the changes. And so I do think this future perfect can happen. I think it happens through partnerships with people in academia, people in industry. Philanthropy can be very important. I think policy and lawmakers. And so I am hopeful that it can happen and that we can improve health. So I just wanted to end before giving questions with acknowledgements of my scientific collaborators in this space, Chiari, Stephanie Main, who was a former postdoc, who's now an assistant professor at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Lindsay Poole, who's an assistant professor with us, and my friend who's the artist, Amanda Williams, who talks about these areas. And she said, you know, we should go on a road show. I can talk about aesthetics, you can talk about health. And I said, you know what, I think that's a great idea. But as Russ said, you can't say yes to everything. And if you do, all you'll do is disappoint people. So I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you today about residential segregation and health with a focus on obesity. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. And I apologize for violating the don't talk at people for an hour. I do try to use active learning and try to get people engaged, but please, now is the time. I apologize. Yes. Thanks.
So as you were discussing it, I was thinking when you talked about the neighborhood and call police.
Mm-hmm.
That, oh, it's going to be the police call and all the stress from that. But it's really the aesthetics of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
That is much more powerful driver, but only in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And you think it's, and then I got to thinking about that, and is it depression? You look around your neighborhood and it's really not very nice.
Mm-hmm.
You get kind of depressed and you start having despair, and then you start eating.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was wondering, you also, so I'm more familiar with Milwaukee.
Yes.
And there are areas in Milwaukee that suddenly get gentrified.
Mhm.
You know, they get popular, people move in and, you know, place gets cleaned up. I'm sure that's true in Chicago as well.
Absolutely. And
So
people
ha-
get pushed further and further out.
So has anybody done, that means seems like a natural
Experiment?
experiment to look at it.
Mhm.
Look at those neighborhoods, the people that stayed there after it becomes gentrified, because that often happens.
That's actually a really good point, to try to identify longtime residents of a community to see how their health has changed. You know, I would have I think that's a good idea to do. My hypothesis would be that they still wouldn't be doing as well as similarly aged people who moved to the neighborhood because long-term exposure and continued, exposure over time. I would still not anticipate they would do as well. However, I suspect they would do better than people from a physical health perspective who stayed in neighborhoods that did not gentrify. With regard to depression, certainly. I do a lot of work. One of my mentees is in psychiatry and behavioral sciences, Ingrid Burnett-Ziegler. And what she has really highlighted is post-traumatic stress disorder more so than depression in women. And that's her area of research is PTSD in women, from having lost loved ones, from having, you know, people taken to jail and taken to prison. She's seeing the PTSD as being the largest mental health driver. We have yet to integrate. So I'm also a sleep researcher. And so she and I started to work together because my thought was a natural way for me to link the mental health work that she's doing in PTSD and depression. One of the symptoms that one would see would be disrupted and disordered sleep. So what we're doing right now is doing some work to try to measure sleep in these individuals, because sleep is a very thoughtful intermediate between a number of metabolic disorders. And some preliminary work that she's doing on mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques is showing that sleep symptoms are getting better in these women who've experienced PTSD with mindfulness-based stress reduction. But no, I think those are really good points. And it is, but I still am not clear why that same effect of the aesthetics is not, if it's the aesthetics, if it's the opportunity, why does it appear to have a less strong effect on obesity in men? And I see different findings. You know, I'm also an obesity and diabetes researcher. And when we were doing research to describe risk factors for disparities in diabetes onset between Black and white men and women, the strongest driver in women was simply obesity for diabetes. And in men, low socioeconomic status was the strongest driver of obesity, or of diabetes incidence in men. So I know it matters, but I don't know. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Every slide was just so interesting, and I just really appreciate it. It's also outside of anything that I think about on a daily basis, but the question that I have for you when you think about when I think about the differences between male and female, I think about a lot of things, but one of them is the role of childbearing in women and raising families. And I wondered if you think that has any role in some of the data.
I wonder. So the role of childbearing, and you've got to take care of children in an environment. But if you had men in that same neighborhood who were also taking care of their children, what would the hypothesis be about why the environment is having a stronger effect in women? Is it yeah. You know, it could be the stress and worry, the lack of time. I mean, I can imagine. I've got I've got 2 young children. Occasionally my husband says he needs downtime, and he like goes to relax and goes places, and I was like, I don't know what that is. I don't take downtime. I do my job and I raise our children together. So, you know, I mean, just in a sexist way, you know, maybe men still go out and exercise, and women are saying, look, I'm busy. You know, if I have to get into a car and drive 5 miles to get to a gym, I'm not going to do it because I've still got to get dinner on the table, and I've got to talk to the teacher, and I've got to get ready for school tomorrow for the kids. And maybe men do it. But I think some of our stronger hypotheses have to do with men being less neighborhood focused and not being as constrained by the neighborhood, by the social environment, by the working environment, and men being, and I don't know about the data, do men work further away from home than women, such that they're working in different communities than women are working in and exposed to more? That I don't know. I mean, an interesting thing about racial residential segregation is when you put things like discrimination, perceptions of discrimination in a model, you get these very interesting findings. So, especially by education level, that people who live in segregated communities actually report lower perceptions of discrimination because they're in predominantly same group interactions. So, you know, when you're working and living in settings that put you in front of different people, your perceptions of things not, you know, of unfairness and discrimination being due to your race or ethnicity are likely to be stronger and more prominent than when you're in single race settings. So part of the challenge that we find in this field really are measurement related challenges. You know, how do we actually measure these different things? Downtime. Whenever I mention downtime, people always laugh. It's like, I don't know what that is.
Thank you. Hi, I work in public health, and I am astounded by your findings because it's very contrary to that which we are always talking about, which is it's about the food deserts, it's about individual behaviors, and all those things that you said did not turn out to be the factors that we normally associate in our public health practice as those contributors to higher rates of obesity.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Compared to the racial segregation. So I just want to, if you could just talk a
Yeah,
little bit about that and how
so,
your colleagues in public health are responding to.
Yeah, I did not mean to communicate that food deserts don't matter. What is happening is that these racially segregated communities are food deserts.
Right.
However, when we have, so, you know, statistically, it's very complicated to include these multiple factors in a model because they're so closely correlated, which is why we use these techniques like marginal structural models to be able to handle multiple correlated things in a model and try to tease out the relative contributions of different factors. No, these, what I meant to clarify, these racially segregated communities are food deserts. That is part of it. However, what we find is that, you know, when we do things to be able to put them into the same model, segregation appears to still have an effect above and beyond the food desert and above and beyond the neighborhood poverty. So I apologize if I misspoke.
No, I think it adds a layer of nuance that we don't get to in most of our public health practice, particularly here in Vermont, where we don't think about our neighborhoods being as different from one another, perhaps, as in fact they really are.
Yeah.
And so I think it'd be really interesting to take your work and look at it through a rural perspective as well.
I agree.
Right? And see if we find some of those same things here or not. I just think it's very provocative from a public health perspective and how we are used to talking amongst ourselves.
Yeah, you know, it really is.
Yeah.
And I really feel as though, you know, when we talk about some of the, so I showed you racial residential segregation and life expectancy in predominantly urban areas. I think we have a whole nother situation in the rural areas, and it's so important and so critical because, you know, access to care is an issue, social isolation is an issue, and there are a number of factors that are very different than the processes that we're seeing in urban cities. What we've been able to study mostly so far are urban cities because that's mostly where we've done most of our cohort studies and our work. However, the work that's going to go on in rural communities, and there is some that's planned and set to start very soon looking at rural health, I think these issues are critically important. I think Russ will be driving a mobile truck around the Southeast to try to answer these questions.
Mercy, thanks so much. This was wonderful talk. As I'm thinking about the findings, the sex differences.
Yeah.
When we look at white populations, Black populations by gender, when you look at biomarkers of inflammation like CRP, the group with the highest level are Black women.
Yeah.
So, you know, Black people have higher levels on average than white people, and Black women have the highest levels. compared to the other three groups. And so I'm wondering, and you know, inflammation is obviously important in obesogenesis,
Yeah.
as is cortisol and other kind of reactive systems. And so I'm just wondering if there is something about how people biologically are reacting in these sorts of systems like inflammation. And
Yeah.
you know, some of the studies you have been evaluating these data and have these biomarkers measured. It might be interesting to just
Yeah.
kind of think
You
about
know,
ways to model that.
Well, and what Chiari's trying to do, maybe with you as a collaborator, is look at, rather than, is to look at stress reactivity. So, you know, we try to measure stress, but, you know, what is the biological response to stress in the body system? How does that trigger inflammatory markers? How does that trigger endothelial dysfunction? You know, I think I'd mentioned, you know, my former life was autonomic nervous system dysfunction. So, you know, do we see greater sympathetic reactivity to insults, to different things? I don't know why I would see a difference for men versus women. I will say, you know, when we look at the prevalence of obesity in Black men versus white men, it's actually not that different. You know, where we see marked differences are really among the women, but the rates of obesity aren't that different between Black men and white men. So maybe that's part of it, a truncated distribution of obesity, or the usual suspects aren't the reasons why Black men are obese. But stress reactivity, I do think there's a lot of work to be done in biomarkers. So I'm hopeful that if you're not a collaborator, that you'll be sitting on a study section where you can advocate for the type of work that needs to be done so that we can figure out the body's response to stressors. Because you can ask someone what a stressor is, but you know, one's perception of a stressor isn't going to be universally the same. You know, the example I cite about crime is, you know, over time. So friends call in the summer and they say, oh my God, I heard 79 people got shot over the weekend in Chicago. And I was like, oh yeah? Huh, I didn't notice. And I was like, oh, you know, I did hear gunshots Friday night, but you know, we were already in, so I didn't worry about it. Which I think 15 or 16 years ago when I first got there, I would have said, oh my God, this is crazy. And now my response is generally like, well, if it wasn't on the block, probably okay. Let's just go to bed. The dog's already been out to pee. We're okay. But, you know, I think over time you do get a little used to it and you get a little numb to the chaos. And so I doubt that I have the same level of reactivity to reports of violence unless it happened to happen right in front of me or right after I had just left a scene, like the FedEx driver who got shot out front. And I was like, oh, how inconvenient. But, you know, but yeah, it tends to happen a lot.
One here.
So, first of all, fish out of water, I teach English. So.
Yes, we need everyone.
Yeah,
That's why I wanted to bring in
so
art. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not collaborating on anything, but this is a question. So I'm interested if there are similar studies for those of us who were born and bred under Jim Crow. If there's similar studies about the health of those populations as compared to those who migrate, are there any comparative studies?
So do you mean migrated moving locations?
For those of us who live under enforced racial segregation,
Yes.
Were there particular health outcomes that differed from the general population, say? And I think that you used the term rightly, Great Migration. What I'm really wondering is whether the Great Migration with regard to health really offered the promise that folks were seeking as they left the segregated South, only in relation to health, right?
Yes. So do they have better health outcomes having migrated out of the Southeast for better opportunities versus those who stayed put?
Did we have better health
By staying put?
By staying put.
That could be done. Yeah, I mean, I can think about a way to do that. Yes. Great Migration, the first wave though, are the first wave of the Great Migration, I don't know that there would still be enough around to do that. Yeah.
But I mean, I just think it's a fascinating question. Too.
Yeah, the way that we would.
It questions
Mhm.
so much of the motivation, socioeconomic motivation, the better life, all of that, right?
Yeah, a lot of times people who migrate, and this is the case with immigrants to the country, those people who migrate have better health and have better education and even self-efficacy to be able to move. So a lot of times those movers would have done better anyhow because of certain health characteristics, education characteristics that drove them to leave. That said, I read that book, The Warmth of Other Suns, and it was not necessary. I mean, some people left under the gun. They weren't leaving thinking, oh, I've got a little bit of education and I can't get the job I deserve, so I'm going to go north. Because that is a lot of people, right? So they got a level of education. They said, hey, look, I'm not being offered the opportunities. I'll go north. Some people left under the gun. And it would be the comparison between those people who left under the gun versus those who didn't. I don't know. I don't know that there's a way to study that now because there's not maybe enough people still living. I mean, that were part of that. But there are still masses of movement. Let me think about that. That might be my next study. No, I appreciate that thought. That's a really good point. Yeah. It looks like you want to throw me out, so I wanted to. Yeah, no worries. There's one more over there. Okay.
So yes, so you were talking about Hispanic and Latino X communities. You talked about acculturation,
Yes.
and then you talked about segregation. So did you see an interaction between the two of them? Because you mentioned that you were seeing an inverse relationship when it came to that. Because that's very interesting, especially when you look at Black migrants and the Black population from the United States. That would be an interesting way to compare the two populations to see what's, because obviously you share the same racial background, but maybe those experiences can give you potentially another answer to what is happening there.
Yeah, no, I agree. There are people in New York who are trying to do this. I don't know. So there's people in New York who are trying to do this because they have some African immigrant populations. They've got some diversity in the Black population of people coming from the Caribbean and from Africa and from different countries to be able to look at different health effects. And in general, the immigrants have better health outcomes than the US born. And part of that is a lot of the immigrants, depending on which age, well, it also depends on which age people immigrate, but the immigrants to the US tended to have higher levels of education. And so they actually had better health outcomes. In the Hispanic community, there was a very interesting interaction, and I have to try to visually remember this slide, where it mattered when you came to the US and your degree of acculturation. So those people who came to the US before a certain age had profiles that looked more like US-born Hispanic Latinos, which had far worse health outcomes and higher rates of diabetes and obesity than foreign-born who came after age 14. Or it was some relatively lower age, but acculturation, and I think the earlier the acculturation takes place, the worse the health outcomes. And it's quite similar to what we see in Pima Indians, where Pima Indians are eating their traditional foods. They do quite well. As soon as they switch over to eating a US-based diet, they have obesity and they have diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. There's not been enough work to disaggregate individuals of African ancestry. And I think in part because geographically, it's been outside of New York, which I believe there's some people doing some work in that area. I have not seen, I haven't seen anyone trying to pull together that type of cohort.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Dr. Carnethon for this fascinating.
Thank you.
Speaker. And everybody have a good evening. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
No. Well, no.
I can also
Well,
it's too easy to not. Yeah.
Carnethon, looking like creative, really
You got a
fabulous
trainer
tasting.
named Carl. Yeah.
Personal chef.
Exactly.